Uh, well, hi everyone. I'm John Coleman from Institute for the Humanities. Hopefully, you didn't hear me cussing just now. Uh, when you do these live broadcasts, you don't have the pleasure of redoing the recording. So here we are, cusses or not, and I am just loving the more complicated StreamYard setup these days. It is just delightful. All right. So here we are. I trust the music isn't blasting in the background. We will get some background music. We're talking about Caesar and Christ and their collision, so to speak, and their merger. And what we mean by this, of course, is the Hebraic spiritual system, which goes in a certain trajectory through Jesus of Nazareth and becomes what we call Christianity, but not before merging with another culture. And that's where we're going today. These words of mine and our time together are preliminary thoughts going into a class that we'll have privately later this morning. So let me get the background music queued up, and then we'll get going here. So we have a history presentation. We're going to be using Will and Ariel Durant's Caesar and Christ, as well as a number of articles, principally focusing on one philosopher, and that is Philo of Alexandria. Okay. And by the way, that opening music was the theme for Caesar 3. You are correct, the old video game. That is way too loud. Okay, there we go. Now we're sufficiently relaxed for our time together. Okay, so yes, we have a lot to go, a long way to go and a short way to get there, but not before an advertisement. And that is very appropriate to this presentation, an invitation to enroll in our monthly seminars. We have many different ways that students can attach themselves to the Institute. Obviously, there's just general learners, people who check into our sites and buy our books from time to time, read our articles. That's one way to absolutely be part of the life of the college academically. Another way is to enroll full-time and to really dive deep, and we call that program here at the Institute the Project. So this is where we meet at least 4 times a week for several hours and really dive into this synchronized study of history, literature, Latin, philosophy, art, all woven together in a single narrative over 2 years. That's for our OGs. That's for our top shelf learners. And we accept students of about 15 years of age on up. That material is taught more or less at an undergraduate level. Between those two, between Charybdis and Sybil, we have a little classical reference there. We have our monthly seminarians, our monthly seminar students, and that is where we choose a text or a couple texts and meet once a month. The program is expanding in various ways, and so as it looks now, and this has worked out well with our students, we'll have our main session each month, and then we'll have a separate session on a separate related text. So for instance, this month of grace, August of 20 and 25, we're looking at Caesar and Christ here, our main book, and looking at this fusion of a few different cultures into what we call Christianity. However, we also had occasion and interest to study the meditations of Marcus Aurelius, or in another class where we're mucking around in the Orient. We're doing that, and we get through our text. And we have an ongoing series on the I Ching. And we'll see much of this going into the autumn with various of our monthly studies. That's very approachable for adult students. It seems to be very workable, and we look forward to expanding that in the months ahead. So that's our monthly program, and that is your advertisement for this session. Okay, so now we get into the matter at hand, and that is going to be looking at Caesar and Christ colliding and merging. And there's a lot of nuance here, which is one of the benefits of study. Because there are ways and there are angles in what I'm saying that can be taken correctly, and there are just as many angles that can be taken incorrectly. Before we get into that, I do like to have a bit of poetry. And given our focus here, and actually, yes, I think the most appropriate thing to do is actually to pull from St. John's Gospel. And we'll read the opening verses, because as Will Durant says in our study, and if you do have the Story of Civilization Volume 3, right, Volume 3, yeah, Caesar and Christ, we're looking on page 501, if you want to cue that up. But as Will Durant says on that page 501, in a sense, Philo is speaking through the pen of St. John. And so we will read some of that here. All right, and I'm just flopping around the missal here. So this is our poetry section. We always like to get a bit of poetry, and this is appropriate. These are the opening words of St. John's Gospel. Again, we're looking in our time together at the merger of a few different cultures, and you're going to see it here. Those cultures are the Hellenic, the Roman, the Hebraic, and not appropriate to our time span here, which is late antiquity, also the Teutonic or the German. These four cultures will come together to produce Christianity, of which the first three, the Greek, the Roman, and the Hebraic, are appropriate to the late classical period. Anyhow, enough of me, more of another John. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things come to be through him, and without him nothing come to be. What come to be through him was life, and this life was the light of the human race. A light that shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. A man named John was sent from God. He come for testimony to testify to the light, so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but come to testify to the light. The true light, which enlightens everyone, was coming into the world. He was in the world, and the world come to be through him, but the world did not know him. And he come to what was his own, but his own people did not accept him. But to those who did accept him, he gave power to become the children of God, to those who believe in his name, who are born not by natural generation, nor by human choice, nor by man's decision, but of God. And the Word become flesh and made his dwelling amongst us, and we saw his glory, the glory as of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth. John testified to him and cried out, saying, This was he of whom I said, the one who is coming after me ranks ahead of me, because he existed before me. From his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace. Because while the law was given through Moses, grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God. The only Son, God, who is at the Father's side, has revealed him. Evangelion Domine laus tibi Christe rex aeternae gloriae. Thus are the words of St. John's opening of his gospel, the opening words. And that happens to be, by the way, one of the Christmas selections for Holy Mass. And in my old Latin Mass days, if memory serves, at the conclusion of the Low Mass, that section would be read every single time, with a few exceptions around Passiontide. Anyway, enough of liturgics. In that section, that's a fine place to step off here. In that section, you really can see the merger of those Hellenic strands and the Hebraic strand. The Hellenic idea of the Logos, the ultimate reality, which we'll explain in the time ahead. I'm going to make just a little bit of time at the end to make coffee before our in-person class. And in any case, we have a long way to go and a short time to go there. You can see the Logos, right? We'll explain that, but also that Hebraic yearning, desire for the Messiah, which is laid out even in Genesis chapter 3 and in Deuteronomy 18, in addition to some other places like in the book of Samuel. This idea of this savior figure. Now that's a very loaded term. What does this mean to be saved? That's for centuries after us. We'll leave it up to church councils and whatnot. But there is this idea of a figure that's coming to save the hide of the Hebrews, who by the first century are they're like a movie star that's seen better days. Let's put it that way. Keep it nice and polite. Okay. Now, that Gospel of St. John is also a good opportunity to elaborate or begin to elaborate on something I said before at the beginning of this broadcast, and that is there are ways in when I say that Christianity is the merger of these different cultures, there are ways that can be taken properly, and then there are ways that can be misunderstood. At no point in this presentation, and at no point whenever I address this, am I advocating for the type of synchronistic explanation of Christianity which began during the Enlightenment. And in fact, some of that does end up in this Caesar and Christ book. So what do I mean by that? I mean this idea like, oh, wow, Christmas is December 25th, and oh, the Romans kind of had another feast day like 4 days before. Therefore, Christmas obviously was just the Christians taking this and repackaging Sol Invictus as the Son of God, the invincible Son, S-U-N. Oh my goodness, they changed it into S-O-N. I'm not. No, that's in secular, early modern gobbledygook. Oh my goodness, as Will Durant says, being a little wicked here, I almost want to kick the book when I read that. So, oh look, here's here's Isis with a baby bird God, and oh my goodness, here's the Virgin Mary with baby Jesus. Obviously, they're the same thing. Obviously, one. Obviously the Christians are stealing from the so-called pagans, and so forth and so forth. Oh my goodness, the Mithridatic cult had a little cake that you would eat, and all the Christians have this bread that you eat. It's obviously the same thing. I am not going there. I don't think that holds any water whatsoever. And more importantly, this is not an apologetical presentation, and I'll try to keep claims of faith on the DL, let's say, but without venturing into apologetics and the ultimate, metaphysical realities at play, even before the first century, as we're going to get into with Philo, the Hebrews were very well aware of certain, profound themes within their mythology and the so-called paganisms around them. And that was one of the interests of Philo. In the time of the church, a little bit later, this will also be an area of focus and attention by the church fathers, those early scholars and bishops of Christianity. Oh wow, look, we have Cain and Abel in the book of Genesis, and oh yeah, there's Romulus and Remus, and actually there's a whole slew of brothers that found cities, and they fight each other, and one kills the other. I mean, this is around a lot, and that's very important to keep in mind. Yes, the similarities between Christianity and the surrounding spiritual systems. But as we're looking at this topic, it's also important, as we would do for, the Mithridatic cult, the Sibylline cult, Islam, many, many moons later, you also have to understand how this system, what we call Christianity, or this Christian movement, it's not even a system in at this point in the early centuries, but this Jesus movement, if you like, how it is different than the surrounding systems, spiritual systems. That's also very important to keep in mind. So There we go. I am not pulling a zeitgeist on you. That's the conclusion of this section. I am not pulling a zeitgeist. Some of you, when you were a little bit older, and when I was or a little bit younger, and when I was a little bit younger, remember that movie Zeitgeist. And probably for a lot of us, that was or actually it was a bunch of movies called Zeitgeist. It was a very influential truth movie, we'll say, maybe 20 years ago. And early on, there's this, this back-to-back-to-back listing of alleged similarities. Most of those things break down, but again, this isn't an apologetical presentation. But I'm not going in the Zeitgeist direction, but rather I am going in a direction which is more comprehensible to a pre-modern understanding of Christianity. This would invite discussions of, what calls itself Christianity in the West. But prior to the Reformation, the contrast between the Hebrew revelation and the Roman society, for instance, that it lived around, the Greco-Roman society, and for that matter, the Persian society and the African, outside of the boundaries of Rome. Of course, the church grows into what we might call, maybe inaccurately, the Nestorian church. It completely grows outside of the Roman Empire, all the way to China at the exact same time. There's a great book, I believe the author's name is Stephen Prothero, called The Lost History of Christianity. And he speaks about this, what they call themselves is the Church of the East, or sometimes you'll hear them referred to as the West Syriac Church. In the West, Catholic and Orthodox, and Protestant tend to call this group of Christians the Nestorians. But again, this is a body of Christianity that grows exactly at the same time that we're talking, but outside of the Roman Empire. And then also, of course, in Ethiopia has its own type of Christianity, which is apostolic, but also not within the sphere of Rome in the way that what becomes Catholicism and Orthodoxy are. And then, of course, in Armenia, there is another apostolic Christian church that develops in its own fashion. But within the Mediterranean basin, what becomes, the trunk of, worldwide Christianity, which might call itself Catholic or Orthodox, they both come out of this Greco-Roman Mare Nostrum. You do see the merger of different cultures, and prior to the Reformation, this would not have seemed very, very peculiar. So, without getting into what exactly happened at the Reformation, let's go back. This is, when you hear me say the plumber begins in the kitchen and ends in the street, this is what I'm talking about. I'm trying to talk about the first century, and then how we interpret this in the 21st century, and then I have to talk about the 16th century. So, in any case, the best place to begin here, when I say that what becomes Christianity is the merger of ultimately four civilizations, the Hebraic, the Roman, the Greco, and the Teutonic, although the Teutonic is a little bit later. I think the principal thing you need to understand, and I need to understand, respecting the Christian thesis, as we must as historians, without necessarily believing it, we have to, understand it's a community that has its own principles, and will operate on those principles like any corporation will. Islam, your family, a nation state, a business, right? A community has its own principles. One of the principles of the Hebrews, from whence comes the Christian movement in its embryo, and whence comes Jesus Christ, is that God acts in history. I don't care whether you believe in God, and I don't care whether you believe God acts in history. That's irrelevant. What's relevant as historians is that distinct belief which offset the Hebrews and subsequently the Jews, who are not Hebrews, it's a separate religion, but they are inspired by the Hebrews, the Christians, and the Muslims. So, in later times, those three religions will come out of the Hebrews. And remember, I just said that there are many, many ways where Christianity is similar to the Greco-Roman paganisms and spiritual systems, but there are ways where it is profoundly different. And one of the most ones, probably the crux one to understand this merger of cultures, is the fact that the Christians coming out of that Hebraic strain believe that God operates in history. God reveals himself through actions in time. Also, along with that, is that God slowly reveals himself little by little by little. Adam's concept of God, especially after the fall, is of a certain level. Abraham's is of a certain level. Moses's is of a certain level. David's. And this concept of God and this appreciation of God and this self-revelation of God is increasingly complex and nuanced and spiritualized, to the point that you get to men like Isaiah or Jeremiah. And they have a very nuanced understanding of Yahweh, or what's sometimes mispronounced as Yahweh, or God, or Jehovah, or what's really mispronounced and mistranslated as Jehovah. But we're not going to get into that right now. But what we will get into is that point, that in the mythological scaffolding of Christianity is this belief that God operates in history, one, and progressively reveals himself, two. Number three is that whilst the Christians will come to believe, as their catechisms say, that revelation ceased at the death of the last apostle, that does not mean the story of the Bible ended, or rather the story of the people in the Bible ended. And this is the third point to understand how could there be a merger before we even lay out the specifics of the Hebraic, the Roman, the Greco, and I think we'll skip the Teutonic for today because it's important, but if we were looking at medieval Christianity, it would be much more of a better use of time. But before we even get into the specifics of these communities, the third point is that the Lord that the Christians pray to, this God, is one who has not ceased operating with what comes to call itself the church. That the church is the Israel and has the attention of God as the Israel of the flesh did in the Bible times. That this same group of people on the earth has continued, or at least the attention of God, because there's this shift between fleshly Israel and then after the time of Christ to true Israel, spiritual Israel. Again, I'm not advocating for this. I'm trying to lay out within the parameters of the Christian movement how it sees itself. It would be another discussion called apologetics to talk about the veracity of these claims. But nevertheless, God keeps working with his people. And what this creates, in addition to the injunction as we read in the Gospels to make disciples of all nations, creates a very interesting dynamic within Christianity in terms of its relationship to the surrounding spiritual systems and the surrounding people who hold those spiritual systems. Before we get into that dynamic, let's lay out three of the four cultures which merge together into Christianity. And again, I'm not advocating a synchronistic explanation of this world religion, but I'm saying there is a truth. Just for my political branch, let's say, you may have heard me say something like, this leftist or this Islamicist guy or this communist, he's right for the wrong reasons, or this MAGA guy or whatever. This guy is right for the wrong reasons. For instance, the modern state, finds itself continually drawn into moral topics and charitable works. And the modern leftist sees this and sees that there's something off about this. And they make the right point. The state's job is not morality, but they do it for in my opinion, a completely misguided reason, right? They're looking at a modern nation state which destroyed the monasteries and destroyed the churches 400 and 500 years ago. And what ended up happening is that all the problems that the monasteries took care of, like education, like the homeless, like unmarried mothers and bums on the street, all the headaches that the church used to deal with, all of it got thrown. It still existed. The problems didn't go away, and the problem solvers went away. The problems remained. And so all of this moral and charitable work fell on the lap of the state. And for the past 500 years, the state has been adjudicating moral and charitable topics. And the leftist is right to say the state has no business doing that. But the leftist doesn't understand why they're saying that. They intuit that there's something disordered about that, but they don't understand the historical reasons for that. And so they are right, but for the wrong reasons. And likewise, when we say, for instance, a very loaded expression, Christianity is pagan, or there's a lot of paganism in Christianity. Yes, there is, but not in the way the zeitgeist people are saying it, not in the way the History Channel people are saying it, and so forth, and the higher critics and whatnot. There is, because it has to do with those 3 points I laid out before. The fact that within the Christian mythology, within the theological scaffolding, Christianity believes that God operates in history. He operates in history progressively, and he doesn't stop operating in history until the end of the world, and that his interaction with the church, his community on this earth, is just as intimate as it was with Old Testament Israel in the desert, for instance. So that creates this dynamic where New Testament Israel has to learn how to boogie woogie with the surrounding communities. And there's another dynamic at play which we can approach a little bit later. But let's lay out these 3 communities. Again, these are all pre-class thoughts before we get into our private seminar. And again, this is a good sample of what you can experience and what you can expect when you, dear viewers in YouTube who might just catch this, or on BitChute or Rumble, all equally useless platforms as far as I'm concerned at this point. But you're not useless, and as in fact, they're not useless platforms if I can speak to people who might enroll in the college. But in any case, this is kind of a sample for you as well of a pre-class discussion. I'd like to do more of these as we move into the autumn and we expand the program. Okay, so the Hebraic system, I already laid out the point that God operates in history, and then also very much on the heels of that, and this also creates very interesting dynamics in later Christianities, is the us versus them strain, right? That's very pronounced. If you read, especially, picking up with Abraham, certainly in coming to its own stride with Moses, that you will be a different people. And the Hebrews had all sorts of ways they would establish this, whether that was dietary restrictions or body modifications or washing, rituals, certainly unique elements of worship, like the refusal to entertain other deities, although they themselves, I happen to be reading the books of Samuel and Kings and things now, that's not always loyally upheld, much to the consternation of the prophets. But nevertheless, there is at least on paper, at least ideally, this idea that the Hebrews are a different people, and there were structural and psychological ways that the formators of that system established this reality. So that's going to play a role in the subsequent Christian movement, the us versus them. And again, this is this dynamic. A simple mind says this is a contradiction. This is not a contradiction, but there are, these different energies. And so, yes, you have in Christianity altogether, and Christianities altogether, this idea of, come out from amongst them, like St. John says in one of his epistles. And all of that Old Testament stuff, leave Egypt, don't marry into the pagans. You are a separate people. There's all of this from top to bottom in the Bible. There's all of this idea of be a separate people. My understanding of the word ecclesia, from whence we get church, is those who are called out principally for liturgical worship, those who leave the polis for some other activity. So there's that aspect, and then there's also the energy of go and make disciples of all nations. One, at least twice in St. Paul, where Paul says that Christ comes and he comes for all creation, to redeem all creation. Not just men, but also animals, plants, and the forces of nature, the cosmos. You maybe have seen the icon of Christ, the Pancreator, or if you go down, there's inspired by that. If you go into the National Basilica in Washington, D.C., where you'll see this big old, hulked up Jesus Christ in the apse of the church. And that's a version of Christ, the Pancreator, right? The creator of all, and also the redeemer of all, the Logos. And so that creates a very interesting dynamic in later Christianity, which will be solved for about 1,000 years with the monastic movement, meaning all of those kind of fanatical, us versus them, black and white, all of those sorts of people end up being, politely shown a monastic cell where they can't do too much damage, because those sorts of people very often can become very holy. The sorts of people that kind of have that red-eyed fanaticism can do amazing works of devotion, amazing works of charity. Those same sorts of people can also destroy communities, rip apart churches, rip apart families, and that energy was very successfully channeled and sublimated for a higher end. Just like in the West, even the secular priest is celibate, and the idea is he sublimates. He takes a sexual energy and an emotional energy he would put into his family, just like the monk East or West does. He takes that time, literally, that he would give to a family of the flesh. He takes that sexual energy. He takes all of that emotional commitment, and he puts it into, in the case of a parish priest, he puts it into his congregation, right? He sublimates that energy, the energy which largely would be inefficiently spent on a family, can be jujitsu'd, if it's the right personality and the person has a true vocation, to a fatherhood of an entire congregation. And that's a sublimation. But also, what becomes the monastic movement is the sublimation of that Hebraic tendency that certain people have. I have it myself in certain topics. There wouldn't be an ApocatastasIs if this wasn't the case. Right? I mean, fanaticism and this idea of let the heavens fall, may justice be done, the devil may care. I mean, we have all of these images in Western speech and so forth about that. Athanasius contra mundum, right? I mean, that energy of let the whole world fall apart, I'm right, that can produce a St. Simeon Stylites or St. Therese of Lisieux, It can also produce, as I know here in Connecticut, just up the road, someone like John Brown during our Civil War period, right? That's the same person. You do understand that, right? St. Simeon Stylites, who stands on a pillar for 30 years praying to Jesus, the energy that keeps his ass on that pillar is the exact same energy that got John Brown surrounded by U.S. Marines in Harper's Ferry, right? That same energy. And so what the monasteries do is they channel that Hebraic energy. I alluded to the Reformation before. What you see at the Reformation, for various reasons, which are very interesting, is that basically the inmates, I just happen to have seen a House on a Haunted Hill, the 1999 remake recently, and it opens with inmates in an asylum breaking out. So basically the inmates, what happens at the Reformation, the monks break out of the monastery, the nuns break out of the monastery, and now they're living amongst us. The zombies are living amongst us. And I'm not doing this to be crude, to religious. I think that's a very beautiful vocation. I'm being a little bit silly, but I am not being silly when I say that the energy that the sort of person who becomes a monk or a nun, that energy is powerful. It is very powerful, and just like gasoline or TNT, that can be used for very useful things, and it can be used for very destructive things. And part of the chaos that becomes Christianity, and I'm not just talking about Protestantism here, also a lot of this energy seeps into Catholicism. If you don't believe me, go right now, go and look in these YouTube Catholics. They are the same crazy eyes that probably should be in a monastery, but they don't. They're too good for a monastery, right? So now they have YouTube channels. It's the same out of control Hebraic energy. So getting back to our discussion here, one of the strands is that Hebraic, and it's delineated by obviously one belief in God who operates in history as the ways laid out, and also operates throughout history, and us versus them. The next community we'll take a look at are the Hellenic peoples, the Greeks. And the Greeks had this idea of the Logos. And a great introduction to this is Plato's Symposium, where he's using the topic of love. But this, for the Greeks, was all of reality. That there was an ultimate reality in this world of forms, and that everything visible and everything on this side of that reality was a reflection, and to a certain extent a type of stratification from this ultimate Logos. You can think of your salad dressing. When you shake up your salad dressing, all the constituent parts are higgledy-piggledy, and then it separates. And that's kind of how the Platonist sees reality, both spiritual and material. The spiritual is higher than the material, and it's almost indeed as if everything is shaken out. And then ultimately, if you keep climbing up these ladders of reality, you get to the Logos. So that's when we speak of Hellenic culture being influential in Mediterranean Christianity. That's what we mean. Part of that is dialogue and discourse, which plays very nicely with the Hebrew idea of God revealing himself. Okay. Another aspect, very important, especially after Nicaea, will be the idea of distinctions. The Greeks make distinctions, and that will allow Christian theology to have a complexity never before seen in any previous spiritual system. This is not to poo-poo so-called paganisms or earlier types of Christianity or different sects of so-called Judaism, but the Greek language, when it is really unleashed on Christian theology, will allow Christian theology to come to a complexity never before seen in human faith and religion. So that's the second one. Also, not for nothing, again, we're not going down the synchronistic path, but not for nothing, but the Greeks also had very anthropomorphized deities as opposed and compared to the Egyptians or certain Semitic peoples. And so there's a certain sympathy naturally, there's a certain sympathy of the gods with man. Now, sometimes that god runs off with your 16-year-old daughter. Sometimes that god steals all your cattle. Sometimes that god is a bastard and sinks your ship in the ocean. So we don't want to get too sentimental about the Greek mythology, but there is this interplay on a very human level between the gods and man in the Greek mythologies. Now, very briefly, the next community which will influence the emerging Christian movement as it becomes the church, and I don't want to get speaking of distinctions, don't trip me up on my language too much, but as this movement becomes this more coalesced hierarchical doctrinaire thing, which is not bad, the next group that you're going to need to understand are the Romans. And what will the Romans bring to Christianity? Well, speaking of hierarchy and doctrine, it will bring the legal system. And so the Roman legal system will become very, very important. Yes, in terms of church administration, in later years. I mean, after a while, Christianity grows. It does need a certain order to it. Everything as it grows needs to have a complexity. Otherwise, it becomes chaos. And the same is true with Christianity in the Roman Empire and without the Roman Empire. And the Roman legal system, just in terms of the nitty-gritty of, jurisdictions and regulating disciplines, and what happens if this monk gets drunk again, or if what happens when you have two bishops in the same territory, and they there are all these questions, and it's the Roman legal system which will be ultimately chosen by the church east and west to administer these sorts of things with statuses. That's what makes the Roman legal system, or that's what makes legal law distinctive. It's the bestowal and the regulation of artificial statuses. Whether that's in conformity with thou shalt not lie, that's another discussion. Of course, the marvel of all of this isn't an apologetics class, so I don't have to answer that question. The marvel of all of these communities is that they do come into a synchronization. They do come into a juggling act. It is remarkable, and this is not a statement of faith. It is absolutely remarkable that all of these elements are able to exist, so to speak, under one roof. That you're able to accommodate the Hebraic fanatic who becomes the monk. Or the Protestant in later history. You're able to accommodate this Roman legal system without the some of that religious aspect to the Roman legal system, which caused the martyrdoms and caused all that tension in the early interaction with the Jesus movement and the Roman Empire. You're able to strain out. That's something that comes together as these different communities, and eventually joined by the Teutonics, come together in this fusion. What is remarkable is this idea of well, I don't mean this in the way you understand this word, whoever you are, but this idea of Catholicism. I don't mean that in the religious sense that you have or I have. I mean this in a lower C sense. That is when all, by the time you get to the 4th or 5th century, that's what you see coming into view. In the truest sense of the word is a Catholicos vision, a symphonic. If you don't like the that word, how about symphonic? That there is this ability within Christianity to strain out. In fact, I think this is one of the parables, strain out the gnat. But to strain out the elements where Christianity cannot compromise or incorporate, and then to continue to use the system. The legal system would be a great example. This caused fundamentally the martyrdoms of the early church, because for the Christians to acknowledge legal statuses, de facto meant they were acknowledging the Roman deities, which in the Roman system were, kind of operating their willpower through the legal system. And yet the Christians were able to strain out the parts they found obnoxious and still use the organizational apparatus of legal law, which serves them in good stead on a certain level in later centuries and indeed later millennia. It is remarkable that this rises to the surface, this idea, and this we must chalk this up outside of maybe certain parables here or there, or certain divine injunctions, allegedly, also to that Hellenic strain. The Hellenic strain of discourse and dialogue, and circling back to the idea of God operating in history. Okay, I promised two things at the beginning of this presentation. One of which was I was going to leave enough time for me to make coffee, which will certainly happen, because after this there will be a live seminar that we will have. And so, just for the last time, what you're seeing here are just some pre-class thoughts before the class proper begins, if anything, just to get my mind in the right headspace for this most worthy topic of the merger of Caesar and Christ. But the other thing I promised you was a nod to Philo. The Zeitgeist people were not the first people to notice that there are a lot of themes in worldwide religions overall that are similar, and a lot of those have at least vague or less than or more than vague analogs within the Hebrew system and the Christian system. It, in fact, wasn't even the 18th century deists and the philosophers who were the first to notice this, nor were the Christian fathers the first who noticed the similarities of their own system with the surrounding mythologies. Actually, this goes back earlier to an Alexandrian, and his name is Philo. And on page 501, yes, volume 3 of the Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant, you'll get to the section on Philo. And Philo, in one man's life, you can see what will become Christianity. Not that Philo was such, but the thinking patterns. You can see that Hellenic so-called Judaism was moving in a very Catholic fashion, setting the stage for something like the Jesus movement. And in fact, the early church had a whole area of theology called the Predicatio Evangelia, the preaching of the gospel. How did the Holy Spirit work with the so-called pagan peoples in the centuries before Christ? We know how he operated with the Hebrews in that distinct way, the church fathers would say. But how did if Jesus is going to come and redeem all mankind, all creation, how does this same Holy Spirit work with the pagans? Certainly you can't just throw them in cold turkey. I mean, God had to work with the Hebrews with baby steps between the time of Adam and Christ. Surely something of baby steps had to be happening with the so-called pagan peoples. And so all of this was quite conscious in the mind of the early church. But even before then, Hebrews like Philo were noticing this and were coming up with their own explanations. And so I'd like just to conclude before I make my sacred coffee with this section here. So I'm just going to put the book on a very precariously balanced Chromebook. So this whole setup is an old computer case, a computer cabinet. It's a beautiful piece of furniture designed for when there were computer towers, a different age altogether. Then there's a shelf attached to that. On top, that's normal, nothing wrong there. Then there's a box. It looks like an old hat box almost. There's a hat box, and then on top of that is the Chromebook, and on top of that is this Story of Civilization. But the balancing act, how appropriate. We're looking at Christianity as a balancing act of four traditions, 3 of which we've referenced in this recording. How appropriate to end with my book balanced on a bunch of things. Okay. So I just want to finish reading the section on Philo. The leader of the Jewish delegation to Caligula was the philosopher Philo, brother of the Arabarch, or manager of the Jewish export trade in Alexandria. Eusebius, the first church historian, describes him as belonging to an ancient priestly family. We know hardly anything else of his life. But his pious and generous character stands out in the many works he wrote to expound Judaism to the Greek world. Kind of a loaded term there, because Judaism, as Will Durant is using, is not the Judaism of today. So if Philo practices Judaism, it's not, what Moshe down at the synagogue is practicing. But that's another discussion. Brought up in the sacerdotal, priestly atmosphere, intensely loyal to his people, yet fascinated by Greek philosophy, he made it the aim of his life to reconcile the scriptures and customs of the Jews with Greek ideas, and above all, with the philosophy of the most holy, Plato. He adopted for his purpose, he sounds like a Renaissance Christian, speaking of the most holy Plato. He adopted for his purposes all the principles that all the events, characters, doctrines, and laws in the Old Testament have an allegorical as well as a literal meaning and symbolize certain moral or psychological truths. By this method, he was able to prove anything. He wrote indifferently in Hebrew, but so well in Greek that his admirers said that Plato writes like Philo. He was a theologian rather than a philosopher, a mystic whose intense piety presaged Plotinus and the medieval mind. God, in Philo, is the essential being of the world, incorporeal, eternal, indescribable. Reason can know his existence, but can ascribe no quality to him, since every quality is a limitation. To conceive him as having a human form is a concession to the sensuous imagination of man. God is everywhere. Quote, what place can man find where God is not? Unquote. But he is not everything. Matter is also eternal and increate. However, it has no life, motion, or form until infused with the divine force. To create the world by giving form to matter, and to establish relations with man, God used a holy intermediary beings, a host of intermediary beings called angels by the Jews, daemons by the Greeks, and ideas by Plato. These, says Philo, may popularly be conceived as persons, though really they exist only in the divine mind. Tu autem Domine miserere nobis. So those are some words on Philo. You can see this reconciliation of the Hebraic mind with the Greek, even in the century before Christ. Now, ultimately, and these will be my last words as I must get that blessed caffeine in me. Ultimately, within the Hebraic system, and you can see this even in the early church, it's not all monolithic, and that there are two main strains, right? So you do have this idea to reconcile to the Greco-Roman world, both in Christianity and in the prior Hebraic system. And then you have that other tendency of come out from amongst them, leave them, that's the pagans. And ultimately, these two things will become, Christianity will be the reconciling force, and then Judaism proper, rabbinic Judaism, will be that idea of come out from amongst them, have nothing to do with them, be completely different. And that Hebraic culture will split irrevocably and frankly be at war until this very day. But you can see, because if you have Philo as an example of that Catholic spirit and that Christian spirit before Christ, likewise, someone like Simon Bar Kokhba is that example of the Jewish spirit. So it's very interesting. And you could go back, I have to run now, but you can go back early in the Pentateuch and see the exact two strains at tension, if not at war with each other. The reconciling Catholicos, universalizing, bring everything into this theological system and into God. And then this other opposite tendency to back away and keep everything at hand's length or arm's length. Fascinating. Absolutely. These are very profound themes when we look at the collision of Caesar and Christ and the merger, but not in the way the world says, not in the way Zeitgeist says, not in the way CNN or History Channel says. They're right, but for the wrong reasons. Anyway, if you want to pursue these, why don't you enroll in a class and we can have all sorts of monthly fun getting into these topics. So check out and do consider enrolling in Apocatastasis as I consider my first giant cup of coffee for the day. Thank you so much. Masalama.